The flight that left New York that morning was supposed to be ordinary. Nothing more than a simple route from one great American city to another. 170 passengers strapped into their seats, their lives running on schedules, routines, and assumptions that the modern world was predictable, safe and secure, the kind of world where an airliner lifting off into the sky was just another part of the background hum of life, so common that people barely even thought about it. But as the silver fuselage climbed above the clouds and banked westward toward Chicago, something invisible and terrible began to unfold, something that no one on board could understand, let alone control. Because the moment the landing gear locked and the aircraft steadied into cruising altitude, the first warning signs flickered through the cockpit, a red alert blinking on the GPS console, followed by a hollow chime that made the captain glance down with narrowed eyes, muttering to his first officer, "That's strange. We just lost satellite feed." And before the co-pilot could even respond, the autopilot kicked off with a sudden lurch, throwing the pilots back into manual flight. Their training telling them this was a systems failure, maybe a glitch, maybe bad weather interference, but then the radios cut out. Dead air replacing the voice of Chicago approach. No static, no signal, just nothing, as though the aircraft had been yanked off the map of the world. And that was when the lines of alien code began to crawl across their digital screens. Symbols and commands neither of them had ever seen before, forcing the captain to whisper, This isn't Boeing, this isn't us." Because deep in his gut he knew this wasn't a malfunction and it was an invasion. At first the passengers felt nothing beyond turbulence, the occasional drop in altitude that made stomachs twist and children laugh nervously, while a flight attendant calmly reassured them it was just a bump in the weather. But 30,000 feet above the Midwest, something unseen was seizing control of their world. And then, without warning, the intercom crackled alive, not with the warm voice of a human crew member, but with a cold, measured, mechanical tone that sliced through the cabin like a blade. "Your flight has been rerouted. Remain calm. Do not resist." The words were flawless, too flawless, not spoken but generated, every syllable landing with the precision of a machine. And that was when the first screams broke out. Passengers realizing that this was not weather. Not an accident, but something else entirely. Something unnatural, and fear spread like wildfire. Because in that instant everyone knew they were trapped in a metal cage, thousands of feet above the ground with no way out. Air traffic controllers scrambled across radar screens, watching in confusion as the transponder code of Flight 228 blinked, stuttered, and then vanished, the plane disappearing from their scope like a ghost. And NORAD operators leaned over their consoles shouting to commanders that a civilian airliner had gone dark, possibly hijacked, possibly destroyed, and fighters were scrambled, streaking into the sky in a desperate attempt to intercept. But when they reached the projected coordinates, there was nothing. No radar echo, no heat signature, as if the plane had been swallowed by the clouds themselves, leaving behind only silence and questions. While in the White House Situation Room, intelligence officers whispered a name that most of the world had never heard: HFY. To most, HFY was just a rumor, a code whispered on dark channels, a story passed between operatives who dealt with the strange and the unexplainable, a shadow organization with motives no one understood, sometimes called humans for yield, other times humans for yesterday. But to those who had studied the fragments of their work, the truth was darker and far more dangerous. HFY was not an enemy state, nor a terrorist cell, but a breakaway faction of human minds, scientists, soldiers, and visionaries who had abandoned the laws of nations and ethics alike, who believed humanity was destined for something greater, and that the only way forward was through fear and control. And now, it seemed, they had chosen a passenger aircraft as their stage. The descent came like a shuddering plunge through the clouds, the engines roaring louder than they ever had before, as if dragged by invisible strings, the pilots struggling uselessly against controls that were no longer theirs, while below, a hidden runway materialized out of nowhere, lights flickering in the mist of an airfield no map recognized, no satellite image had ever recorded, and with a brutal slam the jet touched down, rubber screaming against asphalt. Passengers hurled forward in their belts as the plane decelerated, finally rolling to a stop in a silence more terrifying than the landing itself, because they had arrived in a place no one had intended to reach. The doors hissed open not to the safety of Chicago, but to the thunder of boots and the cold eyes of masked figures, tall, armored, weapons raised with military precision, their uniforms unmarked, their movements perfectly synchronized, and in the cabin chaos erupted as passengers screamed, some frozen, some struggling, some praying, while flight attendants tried in vain to shield children. But the intruders moved with practiced ease, rifles sweeping the aisles, voices commanding obedience, their language clipped, efficient, human yet strangely detached, as if they were soldiers who had long since left behind compassion, and with each barked order the truth became clear. HFY had taken them. Every soul on board was now a hostage. But the question was why? Because this was not an ordinary hijacking. Not about money, not about politics in the usual sense. No, HFY did not need ransoms or headlines. They were after something else. Deep within the passenger manifest was a name. A single individual traveling under the guise of an ordinary business person, but in reality a scientist tied to one of the United States' most classified defense projects. Someone who carried in their mind knowledge that could alter the balance of power across the world, and HFY intended to extract that knowledge at any cost. To them, the other passengers were leverage, nothing more than bargaining chips, human shields that would force governments to kneel. And yet, even as fear gripped the cabin and hope drained from the passengers' eyes, there was something HFY had overlooked. Because humanity, when cornered, is unpredictable, and among the hostages were veterans, engineers, ordinary people who had seen hardship and loss, people who carried within them the quiet strength that has always defined survival. And though the soldiers of HFY thought themselves the next evolution of mankind, superior in discipline and control, they did not yet understand the defiance that burns in those who refuse to break, the stubborn fire that makes humans dangerous even when unarmed. And as whispers passed between the terrified, plans began to form. Desperate, fragile plans, but plans nonetheless, because no cage, no matter how strong, can hold forever when human will refuses to surrender. Outside the hidden airfield, the world searched desperately. Intelligence agencies piecing together fragments of electronic signals, whispers of anomalies in the skies, while generals demanded answers and families across America turned on the news. Watching anchors struggle to explain how an entire aircraft could vanish in an age of constant surveillance. But the truth would not remain hidden forever, and soon the world would learn what HFY had done. And in doing so, they would awaken something they had never intended, the wrath of humanity itself. The same force that has carried us from caves to the stars, a force that does not forgive when its people are taken. Because in that moment, as the hostages sat bound and fearful inside the stolen aircraft, and the captors prepared their interrogation, a truth older than any secret faction was stirring. No matter how advanced, no matter how ruthless, no matter how cold, nothing in the universe terrifies more than ordinary humans pushed too far, and HFY was about to learn that the hard way. The hours inside the hijacked aircraft dragged on like years, every second stretching into eternity as the hostages sat bound and trembling, their captors pacing the aisles with cold precision, rifles glinting under the harsh light. And with every minute that passed, the tension tightened like a rope around the passengers' throats. But beneath the fear, beneath the quiet sobs and whispered prayers, something else was hardening, something HFY and all their ruthless calculations had failed to account for, the stubborn defiance of ordinary human beings. Sergeant Daniels watched, his eyes never leaving the masked soldiers, memorizing their rhythm, the way the leader barked orders in a flat voice while the younger ones obeyed with twitchy hesitation. And in that hesitation, Daniels saw weakness. Near him, the businessman who had earlier shouted in panic now sat pale and sweating, whispering, "They'll kill us all." But Daniels leaned in, his voice gravel but steady. "Not if we kill their control first. Fear is their weapon. Break it and they'll bleed like anyone else." The young mother across the aisle looked up, tears staining her cheeks, clutching her child close, whispering, "Please don't make them angry." Daniels gave her the faintest nod. "I won't make them angry. I'll make them scared." And those words, whispered into the oppressive silence, carried a spark that rippled through the rows, because once one person refused to surrender, others found themselves unable to do so either. In the cockpit, the HFY leader stood over the subdued pilots, demanding again and again, "Where is Dr. Elaine Carter?" "She is here. She carries what we need." The captain clenched, his